Welcome to General Biology. This is Chapter 40 lecture. This is your last lecture for the semester, and you're to be commended to make it this far. You're doing really well. Everybody's grades are doing really well. You're very attentive to your assignments and due dates. So I commend you. You've done very well this semester, and I'm very proud to have been in a part of this semester with you. Online classes are not easy. You have to be disciplined. You have to give attention to detail, and you have to be persistent. And you've done a very good job up to this point. So I commend you on that. But this is chapter 40, our last chapter on biodiversity or preserving biodiversity. Biodiversity, if we could define what biodiversity is, it's the differentness of organisms, of life across the planet. Um, why is biodiversity so important? Well, we depend so much on a pretty high level of biodiversity on the planet, from oxygen production, from pharmaceutical production. As much as 25% of all pharmaceuticals are produced from plants. And we also require resources from the planet to support our lifestyles. And and try not to think so much of the United States. If we can think beyond the borders, it's even more of a reliability on biodiversity. So preserving biodiversity is important. The more complex our web systems are, our food chains, our interdependence, the more complex it is, the less likely it is to collapse on the loss of certain aspects of biodiversity. Does that make sense? Um, if it were a limited or a very simplified food web or food pyramid or biodiversity pyramid, then we would be much more susceptible to environmental catastrophes or changes, and biodiversity would collapse much easier. So biodiversity and a complex biodiverse environment is very important to us as humans and all other organisms. So biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth, and maintaining it is very important. So there are some specific threats, ongoing threats to biodiversity. We, if we want to talk about life in general, as it's threatens, we talk about extinction. That means it's an individual that's no longer present. It's a species that's no longer present. Um, this is a graph over here, a percentage of threatened species in each major of these groups. An endangered species is a species that is it's a high risk of extinction. And then a vulnerable, or what we call a threatened species, is one that is likely to become endangered if we can't make some corrective measures. Amphibians are taking probably the highest, they're probably the highest animal group that is at risk for vulnerable species. Look at this, 41% of amphibians are really struggling right now, probably because they depend on a lot of habitat, widespread habitat, and specific habitat, very moist habitat. Um, Mammals, not quite as bad, but mammals, about almost a third of mammals are threatened with extinction. Birds, not a little bit lower. Birds have, the ability to fly and move is remarkable in birds. It gives them some greater adaptations that other animals don't have. Um, there's some other reptiles there, almost a fourth. The bony fishes, very diverse, and then some other plant species there to the right. But you understand now what biodiversity is, the importance of biodiversity, and how we identify species that are probably threatened with extinction. Why? There's some reasons why. Much of it is attributed to human population growth. We've talked about that before. The importance of trying to monitor or at least lessen the impact of human population growth on the planet. But here's probably the top five reasons why biodiversity across the globe is declining. Habitat loss is one. Habitat loss for a lot of reasons. We talked about the other day. We'll talk about it here in a minute. Just for example, the loss of forest, the primary loss of forest habitat across the globe is for wood burning fires and open flame fires for cooking and heating. Not so much in the United States. We don't need it that much for cooking and heating anymore. But again, we have to think beyond our borders. Areas of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, these are areas where open flame fires are still used for heating and cooking. And that's where in Indonesia, where most of the deforestation is occurring. And due to some agricultural practices as well. Pollution, we'll talk about this for a minute. Global climate change is definitely threatening biodiversity. Invasive species, a little bit more isolated to North America, especially. We'll talk about invasive species, and then overexploitation of habitats and animal species. So habitat destruction is probably the primary threat to biodiversity, just loss of habitat. I think you can envision this, that the larger territory that an organism occupies, habitat loss is more threatening. Does that make sense? Some of our top-down predators, bears, wolves, mountain lions, even broader than that, other habitats across the globe. But this is really important in the United States, where most of our top-down predators are really threatened because of loss of habitat. This loss of habitat forces movements, forces what we call aberrant or abnormal behaviors. It forces conflict. It limits immigration out and immigration in of new gene flows. So habitat destruction, it tends to break habitats down into smaller increments, and that larger, more ranging organisms are the first to be threatened when we lose habitat. This is the red and yellows here are where habitats have been altered the most. Look at here's China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, northeast China, and also Indonesia here, but also the eastern seaboard of the United States. And then the Brazilian impacts of population growth in South America. These are the areas where habitat destruction is most threatening. We've talked about deforestation and urbanization. I'll talk more about urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is the spread of large population areas. We can bring it home in the United States, but especially in India, East Africa, this is where urbanization has become most threatening. In the United States, these population centers where sprawl is moving and expanding into what used to be good habitat, places like Atlanta, we've talked about San Diego, Las Vegas, and also the Dallas-Fort Worth area, DFW. I've seen some reports recently that the DFW Metroplex by the year 2050, 2075 will be the largest Metroplex population center in the United States. It will pass New York City, it will pass Chicago and LA, and it will be the largest Metroplex in the country. All of those individuals, all of those people need agricultural support, they need water support. So urbanization is a multifaceted impact on habitat fragmentation or habitat loss. But deforestation, we've talked about some already. What we call desertification, dry areas are becoming drier, mainly because of poor management. Feral horses and feral burro populations in the western United States, where those rangelands are already struggling. They are depleting rangelands, even wild herds of both burros and horses. But also farming on marginal lands also negatively impacts and increases what we call desertification, large deserts increasing. The desert southwest of the United States, the Sahel regions of Africa, not the Sahara, but the area around the Sahara, what we call the Sahel regions, are expanding immensely as well. What we call desertification. Pollution, increased increased human population growth puts a greater strain on larger populations simply need more support, and we also produce more byproducts. Chemical, physical, or biological changes in air and water quality are the greatest threats. Here's on this table, some of the chemical water pollutants that we are most concerned about. Sewage, of course, but detergents, pesticides, in particular nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers, and just cosmetics. Selenium in plastics is if you ever have some time to just do a little bit of reading for casual reading, but the impacts of microplastics on the environment and on our health is becoming you'll see it more and more in social media and in our news media, in the science community. It's not a social media flare. Microplastics are becoming quite intensively studied in the United States in particular, about the impact of small plastics on the human body. And if they're impacting the human body, they're impacting all animal and plant life as well. And then some persistent, what we call organic pollutants, PPCs and PAHs, hydrocarbons, are also very impacting on human health. And if they're impacting human health, they're impacting all life. Eutrophication, we've talked a little bit about this, the impact of putting more and more nutrients into our water supply, freshwater supply in particular. And remember, freshwater supply is a very, very small, less than 1% of all water on the Earth's surface. So freshwater across the globe are very susceptible, collectively speaking. Nutrients placed in water supplies allows a buildup of plant life. Plant life consumes more oxygen. These waters become oxygen depleted. We call that eutrophication, and we are accelerating the eutrophication process in many of our freshwater ecosystems. We talked about that in the last chapter. Phosphorus and nitrogen input into our water supplies, mainly from fertilizers, is becoming very serious, so much so that there's a pretty significant dead zone where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of New Orleans and Louisiana. There is so much nitrogen, so much phosphorus that it simply doesn't support the animal and plant life in these areas that it once did. It's a result of dead zone kills. So much nitrogen, so much phosphorus. Look to the left or west of the Mississippi River and the upper Midwest, where these are our prime agricultural areas in the United States. And that's where most of this phosphorus and nitrogen depredation begins to occur. You've probably heard the term biomagnification, where if lower life forms on the food web or in the food chain begin to accumulate certain chemicals, then they are obviously consumed by higher level organisms, mid-level organisms, and then the highest level of organisms on the food chain. It's what we call bioaccumulation. These chemicals in particular will accumulate faster in higher organisms in the food chain. We call this biomagnification. A classic one is mercury. You know this, if you have been pregnant as a female, or you as a fisherman, if you fish, you know that the amount of fish intake that's natively caught fish in Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, there are warnings about how much fish you need to consume, because there's some natural deposition of mercury in fish, but it's becoming pretty serious. So much so that we limit the amount of fish intake in certain vulnerable populations, but even non-vulnerable populations, we are to limit the amount of fish intake that we consume, mainly from. So that's what we mean by biomagnification, and mercury is just one of the many. Air pollution, air quality is has been an issue for some time, especially with the automobile production globally, smog or particulates that are suspended in the air, uh, volcanic ash, fossil fuels, heavy metals like toxic organic compounds, and these particulates they can cause serious lung and respiratory tract problems in humans. And if they're again, if it's happening in humans, it's happening in all other organisms as well. There hasn't been quite as much talk in the last decade about acid deposition, but back in the 70s and 80s, it was becoming quite serious. The the amount of acidic particulates in the air that would accumulate in rainfall and fall to the earth and increase acid deposition in forests and in vegetation was becoming quite serious. It doesn't seem to be quite as serious as it was 25 years ago, but still shows up in our textbooks and in science media, science literature at times. More important, though, is the you've heard this, the impact of the ozone. It's a gas in the atmosphere. It limits the amount of UV radiation in the upper atmosphere, and chlorofluorocarbons tend to damage and weaken that ozone. To give you a classic analogy, there are many very decorative lakes and ponds that we can put shading particles in. You've seen these, you just don't really notice it sometimes, but you can put chemicals or what we call shading properties in these very decorative lakes and ponds, and it prevents sunlight from penetrating through the water to the bottom, and it prevents plant buildup, mosses and algae and things like that, and it keeps the water clearer, a little more bluer, a little more greener, a little more prettier. Well, that's it. In essence, that's what the ozone does. It's a shader. It limits the amount of UV radiation that penetrates to the earth. Well, there are so many particulates and chemicals now that ozone layer is being, it's not being depleted, it's just being thinned, it's being impacted. It's not like it's going away anytime soon, but we have taken some measures as recently as 1987 to ban the use of certain things like chlorofluorocarbons, Freon. That's why you don't really get Freon in your air conditioner units anymore, or in our cars or in our homes, is because it's a pretty serious ozone depleter, and hopefully we can identify more things that are depleting this ozone in the atmosphere. Global climate change. We used to have some deniers of global climate change, but climate has been changing for millions of years on the planet. There's no reason to think it should just stop. Climate changes. Climate is very fluid. It's not static. It changes over time, and we are in the midst of a pretty significant climate change right now. This is not unusual, but the rate of acceleration of climate change right now is very serious. It's never changed quite this fast. And you hear things like, "Hey, it's global temperature is only going to change a couple of degrees." Well, yes, but the a, a 1.5 to 3 degree climate change average globally is a significant climate change. What it does is it forces climates that used to be at more mid latitude, it moves them further north or further south. In other words, in 25 years, the temperatures that North Texas has, or Central Texas like Austin, will migrate about 180 miles north and then 180 miles north. So you get what I'm saying, that our springs and our summers and our falls will look more like Dallas. Kansas City's spring and summers and falls will look more like ours. And if you ever travel vertically or longitudinally in the United States in the spring and the fall, you notice big differences in plant growth, greening. And so what global climate change does is it moves climates further away from the poles. Also, altitudinally, it forces climate conditions further up in altitude as well, impacting the way we do agriculture in mountainous regions, impacting ski resorts where I tend to play at. And so it does impact us. And so this is a great graph here of just the Arctic sea ice, which is a good measure of global warming, global climate change. We are at some pretty serious low levels of us. It's not just going to it's not just going to impact polar bears. It's kind of fun to see polar bears being forced out into different areas and greater impacts with humans, but no, that's just an analogy of what's happening globally. If it's happening in polar ice, it's happening everywhere across the globe. So global climate change, it's an important aspect. You and I in the United States in particular, we can probably handle the impacts of global climate change in the next 50 years, the next 75 years. We have the capacity and the resources and the government control and balance to manage the impacts on your life and my life. But that's not the issue in Somalia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia. They do not. They lack the resources. And so the impacts on human life in those third world countries will impact you and I significantly. We can't just isolate ourselves, because you and I will be, the blow will be softened over time, but we will also bear the brunt globally in countries who cannot. So global climate change is very real and very serious. Part of it is because of what we call the greenhouse effect. We've been talking about this for about 30 years now, how CO2, carbon dioxide, is being trapped in the atmosphere. And what that does is it prevents heat from escaping the Earth's atmosphere. And so it just simply warms up. Now, it's not a 30-degree change in 5 years. That's not it. That's kind of alarming. No, globally speaking, it will probably ultimately end up in being about a 3-degree average global increase in temperature. You're thinking, whew, that's not very much. No, that's massive. That's an average global change, and not just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Claremore, Oklahoma. An average 3-degree change can be catastrophic in many areas of the planet, and will be catastrophic in many areas of the planet. If we, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand what's going on here. All you have to do is look at graphs. You can see what's been happening in the last 140 years. The average annual temperature is in green here, beginning in about 1880 up to now, presently. This textbook was published in 2021. You can see look at the shaded areas of CO2 concentration. It correlates right along with temperature change. And then the solid line of blue is some CO2 predictions that we've used ice core samples to measure the deposit of CO2 in ice. And so, hey, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see this. And again, CO2 concentrations along with warmth of the average global temperature is the correlation is too simple to ignore. The last thing last couple of things I want to talk about, and this is not so much in the forefront of the media, but from a conservation biologist like myself, this is probably the most important. It's what we call exotic invasive species. These are species that are not native to a certain area. They were brought in from outside. If you spend any time in the southeastern United States, you've seen kudzu. Kudzu is an invasive plant from Asia, and it literally has nothing to control its population in North America. So it expands like it's difficult to explain how kudzu can literally overtake a landscape. Every telephone pole, every fence post, every tree, everything is covered by kudzu. And if you travel in Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, we even have a few spots in Oklahoma, but our winters are so harsh on kudzu, it's not going to propagate well here. We have a few spots in Claremore where we collect kudzu in our field botany class. But this is what we mean by an invasive species. There's no native predators. There's nothing to check its population growth. It's exotic, meaning it's from outside the United States. If you have a boat, and especially in the western United States where I'm at, if you try to take your boat from one lake to the next, there are inspection stations. You've heard of zebra mussels, and out west there are either other types of mussels where these small, very small, they can fit on the end of your pinky, just a little mussel that propagates, and its population explodes and will literally cover the entire bottom of a lake in a matter of just a decade. It can get into water lines, sewer lines, any kind of water intake valves, clogs them up. If you don't think intake valves are important, they are extremely important for cooling towers and industry, and they are highly invasive, and they are found in Oklahoma waters and very much so in the western United States as well. If we were to monitor individuals who manage our national parks, our wildlife management areas in Oklahoma, our national forests, any wilderness area, Oxley Nature Center. If we ask any manager what's the number one threat to their area that they manage, they will say exotic invasive species. They are probably the number one threat in Oklahoma where you live. It's the number one threat. Bradford pears, what we call calorie pears, highly invasive in landscapes, grassland landscapes. And so this is a pet peeve and a little bit of a soapbox, but we could go on and on about these plants and animals that are invasive and threatening biodiversity, but we have to go on. Overexploitation of plants, overexploitation of habitats, overexploitation of animals, fisheries, all of these are threats to biodiversity, whether it's for trade, sport, or food. Especially marine organisms, marine animals probably feel this impact more than anything else. Anchovies, tunas, meats. Now, again, the impact on the United States is kind of impacting a delicacy for us, eating lobsters and things like that. But in other cultures, China in the Mekong Delta, they were 67 to 70% of their diet are aquatic species, marine species. So again, you and I in the United States, we can probably overcome some of these overexploitation of animal species, but not other cultures, not other societies, and not other countries, where it has become very important. However, there are some success stories. Conservation efforts trying to limit the impacts of pollution, what we call conservation biology. There have been some success stories. Our own classic bald eagle, our national emblem. In the 1970s, maybe less than 2,000 breeding pairs in the entire continental United States, and one of the original members of the endangered species list. The American alligator, one of the original members of the endangered species list in 1973. The peregrine falcon, again, all of these have now been backed off from endangered status to just a threatened or a vulnerable status, or even removed from the endangered species list. all together. Uh, Hooved mammals in North America: elk, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, white-tailed deer, mule deer, probably are at their highest numbers in the history of our continent. We have strong numbers. You know this in Oklahoma. In 1920 in Oklahoma, we had about 200 white-tailed deer, only 200 in the entire state. Now we harvest 100,000 every year during deer harvest. So there are successes. There successes with wild turkey populations, successes with elk populations. So there have been significant successes with conservation biology that kind of offset the loss to overexploitation, and we have to accentuate those. But we don't often think of biotechnology as something that can improve biodiversity, but it can be. The CRISPR technology came into play in the news media recently when an ancient organism was supposedly extinct organism was reborn through CRISPR technology, through DNA technology. A dire wolf, made famous from the TV series. So it's not completely a dire wolf that's been brought back from extinction, but it's some of the genetic aspects of the dire wolf have been added to a gray wolf line, and so some can say technically we brought an animal back from extinction. Well, CRISPR technology or biotechnology can have some pretty positive impacts, especially in plants. We can genetically modify some plants to become more resistant to fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, chestnuts in particular. The chinkapin oak in Oklahoma, we are now producing some strains in our nursery houses that are resistant to the fungal or bacterial infections that cause their extinction or demise. Chestnuts is one of them. The chinkapin oak, I've actually purchased one of these and planted them on some RSU property at our RSU research station, and hopefully we have a chinkapin oak growing there sometime in the future. But biotechnology in the future can enhance our ability to kind of offset some of the impacts against biodiversity. I hope this hasn't been boring to you. It's been a pretty short lecture, but hey, this is the last lecture for the semester, Chapter 40. This is Unit 3. Your exam for Unit 3 will be next week, so we will begin a little bit of a review for that and preparation for that and take that next week. And then the next week will be your final exam for the entire semester, a comprehensive final exam. But I'll give you some instructions about that as we go. You have a quiz to take this week. You also have a couple of labs to complete this week. And you have another Smart Book review to do for Chapter 40 as well this week. I wish you luck, and I'll be talking to you in the next week or so as we prepare for these final 2 exams in the semester. Have a great week.